In this lecture, we are going to answer the question, what is GRC? And as we'll see, GRC is an acronym for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And two of these terms should hopefully be very fresh on your mind. Those are governance and risk. We will do a very quick review of those two terms and then turn to defining compliance. And we will end with a definition of auditable. Again, GRC is an acronym for Governance, Risk, and Compliance, and you typically see this in the context of tools or platforms that centralize the governance, risk, and compliance processes. We have already defined the term governance. As a quick review, governance is a system of rules, practices, and processes. These rules, practices, and processes determine how the program is directed. Governance consists of a number of mechanisms through which the objectives of the program are achieved. Risks are managed and performance is optimized. And governance helps to balance the interests of various stakeholders throughout the organization. For example, how can we both satisfy management's requirements, meet our customers' expectations, and all the while satisfy and be collegial with all of the other programs throughout the organization. Up until this point in the course, we have touched on risk just a little bit. We are going to deal with this in more detail in Domain 3, and if you're really antsy and you just have to have more risk, you can jump ahead to Domain 3 and learn more about that after you finish this lecture. In the meantime, all you need to know for right now is that risk is the potential for harm, and a formula risk management professionals typically use to help us quantify or determine how much risk we have is risk equals threat times vulnerability. And we're using multiplication here because if we do not have a threat, if the threat is 0, then the risk is also 0 because anything times 0 is 0. Similarly, perhaps we have a threat but no vulnerability, then again we have no risk. In short, and again we discuss this in more detail in Domain 3, we manage risk by identifying the risk and then implementing a control. And a control is a measure that is used to mitigate risk. This is all you need to know for now. I will go over a couple examples of risk, both a general example that you deal with most likely on a daily basis, and then privacy-specific risk when we talk more specifically about risk and the types of risk in Domain 3. And so now we know that the G stands for governance, we know that the R stands for risk, and the final C stands for compliance. And compliance means that we have auditable policies, processes, and procedures that ensure legal and regulatory requirements are met. And compliance, or at least demonstrating compliance, means that we have evidence that we could give to someone, such as a regulator or an auditor, and that evidence would demonstrate that the requirements are being met. And sometimes that evidence is referred to as artifacts. One example we've touched on a little bit, but we have not yet fully gone into, is the Privacy Impact Assessment, or the Data Protection Impact Assessment. A privacy impact assessment is a risk management tool as well as a process that helps analysts determine what type of risks an organization assumes when they spin up or when they stand up a particular system or they start collecting certain types of data. And again, we're going to talk more about PIAs, privacy impact assessments, and DPIAs when we get to Domain 3, which is the assess stage of the privacy program governance life cycle. But I bring up the PIA just as one example of a compliance artifact that we would give to an auditor or a regulator. And so again, a regulator would come and they would knock on your door and they would say, hey, I want to make sure that all of your systems are in compliance. We would hand over a lot of evidence, and part of that evidence would be a PIA. The final term that we're going to address in this lecture is auditable, and we really touched on this just a moment ago when we were talking about compliance. When we're talking about an auditable policy, process, or procedure, we mean that an internal or external auditor can observe and determine with certainty that that policy, process, or procedure is being implemented effectively. Again, looking at the example of privacy impact assessments, if your organization has 50 different systems, the auditor wants to make sure that you've conducted a risk assessment on those systems. They're going to ask for your library of privacy impact assessments. We're going to talk more about internal and external auditing later. In case you're curious now what the difference is there, an internal auditor would be a member of your organization that performs internal audits, whereas an external auditor would come from another organization, a third-party auditor, for example. In this lecture, we have defined what GRC is. Again, GRC is an acronym for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. Governance is a system of rules, practices, and processes that determine how a program is directed. Risk is the potential for harm. The formula that you need to remember is risk equals threat times vulnerability. And as we'll discuss at the beginning of Domain 3, we manage risk by first identifying the risk and then implementing controls. An organization is compliant when it has auditable policies, processes, and procedures that ensure that the legal and regulatory requirements of the organization are being met. And again, we would demonstrate compliance by providing an auditor or regulator with evidence. And this evidence is often also referred to as an artifact. And finally, when it comes to having an auditable policy, process, or procedure, this means that an internal or external auditor can observe that this policy, process, or procedure is being implemented effectively.